The smoke had barely cleared from the charred remains of the city when the survivors began to emerge from their refuges beyond the walls. For 5 days in early September 1666, flames had consumed the heart of London, leaving behind a landscape so transformed that those who had fled scarcely recognized their former home. The fire had taken 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and the old Cathedral of St. Paul's, reducing centuries of history to ash and rubble. Yet, even as the embers still glowed among the ruins, the resilience that would define London's remarkable recovery was already beginning to manifest itself. The immediate aftermath presented scenes of almost biblical devastation. Where once narrow streets had teemed with merchants, apprentices and housewives going about their daily business, there now stretched acres of blackened waste. The Great Fire had consumed approximately 436 acres within the city walls and another 63 acres beyond them. Stone walls stood like tombstones marking where buildings had been, while cellars gaped open to the sky, their wooden floors and everything above them obliterated. The intense heat had been so great that it had melted the bells in church towers and turned stone to powder in places. Lead from the roof of St. Paul's Cathedral had run down the streets like rivers of silver, pooling in the gutters, and solidifying into grotesque shapes that would remain for months as grim reminders of the catastrophe. The human cost, though remarkably light in terms of recorded deaths, was nonetheless profound in its social and economic dimensions. Perhaps only 6 people were officially recorded as having perished in the flames, though the true number was almost certainly higher, as the deaths of the poor and the homeless often went unrecorded. But beyond the matter of mortality, the fire had rendered nearly 100,000 people homeless, in a city whose total population was perhaps 400,000 souls. These displaced Londoners had fled to the fields of Moorfields, Islington and Highgate, carrying what few possessions they had managed to salvage. They camped in makeshift shelters, their goods piled around them, uncertain of their futures, and watching the smoke rise from what had been their homes. King Charles II, who had fought the fire alongside his subjects, was acutely aware that the situation demanded immediate and decisive action. The potential for social unrest was immense. Hungry, displaced people with no shelter and no means of earning their livelihoods could easily become a mob. Foreign enemies might take advantage of England's moment of weakness. There were already rumors spreading through the refugee camps that the fire had been started deliberately by the Dutch, with whom England was at war, or by French Catholics, or by any number of other supposed conspirators. Several foreigners had already been attacked by angry crowds seeking scapegoats for the disaster. Within days of the fire's end, the king issued a proclamation designed to address the most pressing concerns. He established markets in several locations outside the devastated area, where food could be sold to prevent price gouging and ensure the population could be fed. He encouraged landlords in the surrounding parishes to take in refugees and promised that the displaced citizens would be welcomed in other towns if they chose to relocate temporarily. Most importantly, he began to articulate a vision for rebuilding that would transform London from a medieval warren of wooden houses into a modern city of brick and stone. The question of how to rebuild was complicated by the city's complex system of property rights and jurisdictions. London was not a unified entity governed by a single authority. The old city of London, the square mile within the ancient walls, was governed by the Lord Mayor and the Court of Aldermen, a body representing the city's powerful guilds and wealthy merchants. Beyond the walls lay areas under different jurisdictions, including lands belonging to the Crown and to the Church. Any plan for reconstruction would need to navigate this intricate web of competing interests and ancient privileges. Christopher Wren, who was already known as a gifted mathematician and architect, was among the first to present a comprehensive plan for rebuilding. Within days of the fire's end, he had drawn up a scheme that would have utterly transformed London's layout. His vision called for wide, straight boulevards radiating from central points, creating a rational grid that would have made London resemble the grand cities of continental Europe. St. Paul's Cathedral would be rebuilt at the end of a long processional way, and the chaos of medieval streets would be replaced by order and symmetry. It was a bold and beautiful vision, one that would have created a city of unprecedented grandeur. John Evelyn, The diarist and gentleman scholar also submitted a plan. His design similarly emphasized straight streets and classical proportions, with regular squares and a rebuilt Thames embankment that would create a magnificent riverside prospect. Other planners came forward with their own schemes, each attempting to impose reason and beauty on the jumbled geography that the fire had erased. These plans reflected the contemporary fascination with continental architecture and urban design, particularly the grand projects being undertaken in Paris and Rome. Yet for all their aesthetic merit, these comprehensive schemes proved impossible to implement. The fundamental problem was that property rights remained in force even when the buildings themselves had been destroyed. Owners of land in the burned district still held title to their plots, and any plan that would have rearranged the street pattern would have required a massive reorganization of property ownership. Some owners would have found their land condemned for new streets, while others would have received more valuable plots. The legal and financial complexities of such a redistribution were staggering, and the political will to force it through was simply absent. Moreover, the city's inhabitants and property owners were desperate to resume their lives and livelihoods. Merchants needed to reopen their shops, craftsmen their workshops, landlords their rental properties. Every day of delay meant lost income and growing debts. The idea of spending months or years working out a completely new street plan, while lawyers argued over compensation, was intolerable to people who needed to rebuild immediately simply to survive. The pressure for rapid reconstruction was intense and irresistible. The compromise that emerged retained the basic medieval street pattern while imposing new regulations on construction. A series of parliamentary acts passed in the months following the fire established the framework for rebuilding. The most important of these was the Rebuilding Act of 1667, which codified new standards for construction that would make the city both safer and more uniform in appearance. The act prohibited the construction of wooden buildings in the burned area, requiring instead that all new structures be built of brick or stone. It established standard designs for houses based on their value and location, creating 4 categories of buildings that would give the rebuilt city a more regular appearance than the chaotic mixture of styles that had existed before. These regulations represented a fundamental shift in how English cities conceived of building control. Previously, construction had been largely a matter of individual choice within the constraints of guild regulations and local customs. Now the state was asserting the right to dictate how private property could be developed in the interest of public safety and urban order. The act specified the thickness of walls, the materials to be used, and even the heights of stories. It was an unprecedented intervention in property rights, one that would have been unthinkable before the fire created both the opportunity and the necessity for such reforms. The question of how to fund reconstruction was equally pressing. The fire had destroyed property worth millions of pounds at a time when the king's annual revenue was less than 2 million. Private property owners would need to bear most of the cost themselves, but public buildings and infrastructure would require public funding. Parliament eventually agreed to levy a tax on coal entering the city, with the revenues dedicated to rebuilding. This coal tax would prove remarkably effective, generating substantial sums over the decades it remained in force. It paid for the reconstruction of St. Paul's Cathedral, dozens of parish churches, and essential public works like the rebuilding of prisons and the construction of new wharves along the Thames. Before rebuilding could begin in earnest, the enormous task of clearing away the debris had to be undertaken. The rubble from destroyed buildings lay in enormous heaps throughout the burned district. Cellars were filled with collapsed masonry and charred timbers. In some places, the debris stood several feet deep in the streets, making them impassable. The city organized work crews to begin the clearing, but it was a monumental undertaking that would take months. The rubble was carted away to be used as fill in marshy areas along the Thames, or simply dumped in designated waste areas. Some of it was recycled, with bricks cleaned and reused if they were still sound. One of the most contentious aspects of the clearing process involved cellars and foundations. Many property owners wanted to rebuild on their old foundations to save money and time, but surveyors worried that fire-damaged stonework might not be sound. There were disputes over whether old foundations could be reused or whether they needed to be torn out and replaced, These seemingly technical questions had significant financial implications, as rebuilding from scratch was far more expensive than building on existing foundations. The process of surveying the destroyed areas and re-establishing property boundaries proved extraordinarily complex. The fire had consumed not just buildings, but also the fences, walls, and markers that had defined property lines. In many cases, the only people who knew exactly where one property ended and another began were the owners themselves, and even they sometimes disagreed. The city appointed surveyors to measure and map the destroyed areas, creating detailed records of who owned what and where boundaries lay. This was essential work, but it was also time-consuming and subject to disputes. Among the surveyors working on this task was Robert Hooke, a brilliant scientist and architect who would play a crucial role in the physical reconstruction of London. Hooke worked alongside other surveyors to measure plots, settle disputes, and certify that new buildings conform to the regulations. His notebooks from this period reveal the painstaking nature of the work, as he recorded measurements down to inches and noted the condition of old foundations and walls. This surveying work was essential to ensuring that property rights were respected, even as new buildings rose, and it helped prevent the chaos that might otherwise have resulted from unclear boundaries. As the clearing and surveying progressed, individual property owners began to rebuild. The speed with which construction commenced was remarkable. Within months of the fire, new buildings were already rising in some areas. The building trades, which had lost many of their workshops and tools in the fire, reorganized quickly. Bricklayers, carpenters, plasterers, and other craftsmen found themselves in high demand, and wages rose accordingly. Workers came from other parts of England to take advantage of the employment opportunities that reconstruction offered. The sound of hammering and sawing filled the air, where shortly before there had been only silence and desolation. The new regulations required that buildings be constructed of brick or stone with tile roofs, rather than the timber frames and thatch that had been common before the fire. This requirement meant that the construction process was somewhat slower and more expensive than it would have been with traditional methods, but it also meant that the new city would be far more resistant to fire. The regulations specified that party walls between buildings needed to be especially thick and built of brick to prevent fires from spreading from one property to another. These requirements, irksome as they were to some property owners, would prove their worth in the centuries to come, as London never again suffered a conflagration on the scale of the Great Fire. The standardization of building types created a more uniform streetscape than London had known before. The Rebuilding Act had established 4 classes of houses. The smallest and cheapest were 2 stories high and fronted on narrow lanes and alleys. The next class added a 3rd story and fronted on streets and lanes of note. The 3rd class added a 4th story and fronted on high and principal streets. The grandest houses, of which there would be relatively few, could be built to individual designs, but still had to conform to basic standards regarding materials and fire safety. This system created a city that was more orderly and rational in appearance, while still allowing for variation in individual buildings. Financing reconstruction presented enormous challenges for many property owners. Those who had lost everything in the fire often lacked the capital needed to rebuild. Some were able to borrow money, but interest rates were high, and lenders were understandably cautious about extending credit in such uncertain times. Disputes over insurance claims complicated matters further. Fire insurance, as we know it today, barely existed in 1666, though some property owners had private arrangements or belonged to mutual aid societies that provided some assistance. The inadequacy of these arrangements would lead to the founding of the first modern fire insurance companies in the years after the fire, but that development came too late to help those facing immediate reconstruction costs. Property owners who lacked the means to rebuild sometimes sold their land to those with more capital. This led to some consolidation of ownership, as wealthier individuals bought up multiple lots and erected substantial buildings. In other cases, groups of smaller property owners pooled their resources to rebuild together. The Rebuilding Act had provisions allowing for the exchange and consolidation of plots where all parties agreed, which facilitated some reorganization even within the constraints of the existing street pattern. These arrangements required careful negotiation and legal documentation, but they allowed for somewhat more efficient use of land than the extremely fragmented ownership that had characterized some areas before the fire. The rebuilding of churches presented particular challenges and opportunities. 87 parish churches within the walls had been destroyed or severely damaged by the fire. Many of these parishes had been very small, sometimes containing only a few dozen families. The decision was made to consolidate parishes and rebuild only 51 churches, rather than attempting to reconstruct all that had been lost. This consolidation made sense both financially and practically, as it would have been enormously expensive to rebuild so many churches, and some of the old parishes had been too small to be viable. Christopher Wren was appointed to oversee the reconstruction of the city's churches, a commission that would occupy him for decades and establish his reputation as one of England's greatest architects. The new churches he designed were remarkable for their variety and ingenuity. Working within the constraints of irregular medieval plots and existing foundations, Wren created buildings of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. He experimented with different forms and spatial arrangements, designing interiors that were suited to Protestant worship, while incorporating classical architectural elements. Many of his churches featured distinctive towers and steeples that became landmarks in the rebuilt city, helping people navigate and identify different neighborhoods. Each church presented unique challenges. The sites were often irregular in shape, hemmed in by neighboring properties and following the alignment of medieval streets. Wren had to design buildings that would fit these awkward plots, while still creating impressive interiors with good sightlines and acoustics. He used a variety of solutions, experimenting with different arrangements of columns, galleries, and ceiling designs. Some churches were rectangular, others nearly square, and a few had more complex plans. The variety of his solutions demonstrated both his architectural creativity and his practical problem-solving ability. The financing of church reconstruction came primarily from the coal tax, supplemented by donations from parishioners and other benefactors. Wren had to work within tight budgets, which required him to be economical while still creating buildings that would inspire and uplift worshippers. He achieved this balance through careful design and the judicious use of ornament, concentrating decorative elements where they would have the greatest impact while keeping other areas relatively plain. The result was a collection of churches that were both beautiful and affordable, buildings that served their religious purpose while also contributing to the architectural character of the rebuilt city. The reconstruction of St. Paul's Cathedral was the most ambitious and significant building project in the rebuilding of London. The old cathedral had been one of the largest churches in Christendom, a Gothic structure that had dominated the city's skyline for centuries. The fire had destroyed it so completely that reconstruction of the old building was impossible. A new cathedral would have to be built, one that would symbolize London's recovery and embody the aspirations of the age. Wren was appointed to design it, and the project would consume much of his professional life for the next 40 years. Wren's early designs for St. Paul's were radical, proposing a building that would have been unlike any English cathedral built before. He conceived of a great domed structure in the classical style, more similar to Italian Renaissance churches than to English Gothic cathedrals. His designs went through multiple iterations as he struggled to reconcile his architectural vision with the expectations of church officials and the practical constraints of the site and budget. The clergy wanted a building with a traditional cathedral layout, with a long nave and prominent choir. Wren wanted to create a centralized space under a great dome. The compromise that eventually emerged retained elements of both visions. Construction of the new St. Paul's began in earnest in the 1670s and would continue well into the 18th century. It was an enormous undertaking that required thousands of workers and vast quantities of materials. Stone had to be quarried and transported to London, timber cut and shaped, lead cast for the roof and dome. Wren oversaw every aspect of the work, from the grand conception to minute details of decoration. He was constantly present on site, resolving problems and adjusting designs as circumstances required. The cathedral slowly rose above the city, its great dome becoming visible for miles around and serving as a symbol of London's revival. While churches and public buildings were being reconstructed, the rebuilding of private houses and commercial buildings proceeded apace. By the early 1670s, much of the burned area had been rebuilt, and the city was once again bustling with activity. The new buildings were generally more substantial and better constructed than those they replaced. The streets, though following the old medieval pattern, were somewhat wider and more regular than before. The use of brick and stone rather than timber gave the city a different appearance, more sober and uniform but also more permanent and secure. The rebuilt city was not without its problems. The rapid pace of construction led to some buildings being erected hastily and without proper attention to quality. There were complaints about crooked walls, poor foundations and shoddy workmanship. The surveyor's office tried to maintain standards by inspecting buildings and refusing to certify those that did not meet the regulations, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some builders cut corners to save money or speed construction, gambling that they would not be caught or that any defects would not become apparent until long after they had been paid. The social geography of London shifted somewhat in the wake of the fire and reconstruction. Some wealthy families who had lived in the city moved to the fashionable new developments in the West End, which had not been affected by the fire. This began a gradual process by which the City of London became increasingly dominated by commerce rather than residence, a trend that would accelerate in the following centuries. At the same time, the rebuilt city attracted new residents, including many who had previously lived outside the walls. The rebuilding created opportunities for social mobility, as some individuals who had been craftsmen or small traders before the fire were able to establish themselves as substantial property owners in the new city. The guilds, which had been central to the economic and political life of the city, faced challenges in the post-fire period. Many guild halls had been destroyed, and the organizations had to rebuild their institutional infrastructure along with their physical premises. The disruption caused by the fire and the influx of workers from outside London to assist with reconstruction put pressure on the guild's traditional control over their trades. There were disputes over whether craftsmen from other cities should be allowed to work in London, and whether they should be required to join the appropriate guilds. These conflicts reflected broader tensions between traditional forms of economic organization and the pressures of a rapidly changing economy. The experience of rebuilding transformed London's approach to urban governance and planning. The regulations imposed after the fire established precedents for building control that would influence urban development in England for centuries to come. The principle that the state could regulate private construction in the interest of public safety and urban order became accepted, paving the way for more extensive planning regulations in later eras. The surveying and mapping work undertaken as part of reconstruction also contributed to a more systematic understanding of urban space and property relationships. The coal tax that funded much of the public reconstruction proved to be an effective mechanism for raising substantial sums over an extended period. It demonstrated that indirect taxation on consumption could generate reliable revenues for specific purposes. This precedent would be followed in later infrastructure projects. The tax remained in force for many decades, continuing to fund urban improvements long after the immediate work of rebuilding was complete. It paid not only for churches and public buildings, but also for infrastructure improvements like better drainage, new streets, and the rebuilding of the city's gates. The reconstruction period saw significant developments in the organization of the building trades. The enormous demand for construction work led to changes in how building projects were organized and managed. Larger-scale contractors began to emerge who could take on substantial projects and coordinate the work of multiple craftsmen. This was a departure from the previous system, in which property owners typically dealt directly with individual craftsmen from different trades. The emergence of these contractors represented an early step toward the modern construction industry, with its complex project management and coordination of multiple specialties. The quality of materials became a significant concern during reconstruction. The huge demand for bricks, tiles, lime for mortar, and timber strained supply chains. Brickmaking, which had previously been a relatively small-scale local industry, expanded rapidly. Brick fields appeared around London's periphery, producing millions of bricks to feed the rebuilding effort. The quality of these bricks varied considerably, as some producers cut corners in their rush to supply the market. Similarly, timber supplies were stretched, leading to concerns about the quality of wood being used in construction. Regulations attempted to maintain standards, but enforcement was difficult given the scale and pace of rebuilding. The reconstruction of the Thames waterfront was particularly important for London's economy. The wharves and warehouses along the river were essential to the city's role as a major port and trading centre. The fire had destroyed many of these facilities, disrupting trade at a time when England was at war with the Dutch and needed to maintain its commercial strength. Rebuilding the waterfront infrastructure was therefore a priority. The work involved not just reconstructing individual buildings, but also improving the river frontage itself, creating better quays and landing places. This work was funded partly by the coal tax and partly by the private owners of riverside properties. The reconstruction period coincided with important developments in English science and technology. The Royal Society, which had been founded in 1660, was at the height of its creative energy in the decades following the fire. Many of the individuals involved in planning and executing the rebuilding were also Fellows of the Royal Society, including Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke. They brought scientific approaches to architectural and engineering problems, applying mathematical analysis and experimental methods to questions of structural design, materials, and construction techniques. This intersection of science and practical building contributed to innovations in architecture and engineering. Robert Hooke's work on the elasticity of materials, for instance, had direct applications to understanding how buildings responded to loads and stresses. His law of elasticity, which he published during the Reconstruction period, helped architects and engineers understand the behavior of structural elements. While the practical application of such theoretical knowledge was still limited by the empirical nature of construction practice, it represented the beginning of a more scientific approach to building design. This marriage of theoretical understanding and practical application would characterize much of the best architecture and engineering of the following centuries. The reconstruction of London also had implications for the development of firefighting capabilities. The inadequacy of the city's firefighting arrangements had been brutally exposed by the Great Fire. The parish-based system of firefighting equipment had proven wholly inadequate to deal with a major conflagration. In the wake of the fire, there was increased attention to maintaining better equipment and ensuring that firefighting resources were adequate. The development of fire insurance companies in the years following the fire also led to improvements in firefighting, as these companies maintained their own firefighting brigades to protect insured properties. The new fire insurance companies that emerged in the wake of the Great Fire represented an important innovation in risk management. The Fire Office, established in 1667, was one of the first. These companies insured buildings against fire damage in exchange for annual premiums. They issued fire marks, metal plaques that identified insured buildings, and maintained firefighting equipment and trained crews who would respond to fires in insured properties. While this system was far from perfect and left uninsured properties vulnerable, it represented a significant advance in managing fire risk. The insurance industry would grow and develop over subsequent decades, becoming an important part of London's financial sector. The cultural and psychological impact of the fire and reconstruction was profound. The disaster had been traumatic, displacing much of the population and destroying familiar landmarks and neighbourhoods. The rebuilding process, however, became a source of pride and optimism. Londoners could see their city rising from the ashes, transformed and improved. The new buildings, though built on old foundations in many cases, represented progress and modernity. The churches with their elegant steeples, the substantial brick houses, the wider and cleaner streets all contrasted favourably with the crowded, ramshackle medieval city that had been lost. This sense of renewal was reflected in contemporary literature and commentary. Writers celebrated London's recovery and praised the beauty of the new city. John Evelyn, in his diary and published works, expressed satisfaction with many aspects of the reconstruction, even as he regretted that more comprehensive reforms had not been implemented. Samuel Pepys, whose diary provides invaluable insights into daily life during this period, recorded his observations of the rebuilding with a mixture of fascination and concern. He noted the rapid pace of reconstruction, the rising property values, and the speculation that accompanied the rebuilding process. The reconstruction period saw significant property speculation as investors sought to profit from the rebuilding. Land that had been damaged or destroyed by the fire could be purchased relatively cheaply, rebuilt, and then sold or rented at substantial profits as the city recovered. This speculation was not without risks, as property values fluctuated and some speculators overextended themselves. However, those who judged the market correctly could make substantial fortunes. This speculative activity contributed to the rapid pace of rebuilding, but also created concerns about profiteering and about whether reconstruction was being driven by genuine need or by financial opportunism. The relationship between landlords and tenants became strained during the reconstruction period. Many tenants had lost their homes in the fire, but remained legally obligated to pay rent on destroyed properties under the terms of their leases. This created significant hardship and led to numerous disputes. The courts eventually ruled that tenants were not obligated to pay rent on destroyed properties, but only after considerable litigation. The reconstruction also saw rents rise substantially in the rebuilt city, as landlords sought to recover their rebuilding costs and take advantage of the housing shortage. This made it difficult for poorer residents to remain in the city, contributing to social displacement. The rebuilding of markets was essential to restoring the city's commercial life. Several important markets had been destroyed by the fire, including markets for fish, meat, and vegetables. Temporary markets were established in the immediate aftermath of the fire, but permanent replacements needed to be built. The reconstruction of these markets involved not just building structures, but also establishing systems for regulating trade, ensuring food safety, and collecting market fees. The new markets were generally more substantial and better organized than their predecessors, with proper drainage and more sanitary conditions. The reconstruction of prisons and other civic buildings was funded by the coal tax and represented an opportunity to improve on medieval facilities that had been notoriously inadequate. Newgate Prison, which had been destroyed by the fire, was rebuilt as a more substantial and secure facility. While prison conditions remained harsh by modern standards, the new building was an improvement over the medieval structure it replaced. Similarly, other civic buildings like the Sessions House where courts met were rebuilt with more attention to functionality and dignity. The process of compensation for property acquired for street widening and other public improvements proved contentious. When streets were widened or new through routes created, some property owners lost land, while others benefited from increased access and property values. The Rebuilding Acts provided mechanisms for compensation, but determining fair values was difficult and subject to dispute. Arbitrators were appointed to settle disagreements, but the process was often slow and contentious. Some property owners felt inadequately compensated, while others were accused of trying to profit from public improvements. The reconstruction of infrastructure below street level was less visible but no less important than the rebuilding of structures. The city's water supply system, which had relied on pumps and conduits, had been damaged by the fire. Repairing and improving this system was essential to the health and functioning of the rebuilt city. Similarly, drainage and sewer systems needed to be rebuilt and, in some cases, improved. This infrastructure work was technically challenging and expensive, but it was essential to creating a healthier urban environment. The improvements made during reconstruction contributed to better public health outcomes in subsequent decades. The role of the Court of Aldermen and the Lord Mayor in managing reconstruction was crucial. These civic leaders had to balance multiple competing interests and pressures while maintaining order and ensuring that reconstruction proceeded efficiently. They worked with Parliament to draft and implement the Rebuilding Acts, negotiated with property owners and developers, and oversaw the surveying and inspection processes. The Corporation of the City of London emerged from the reconstruction period with its authority enhanced, having successfully managed an enormous and complex undertaking. The relationship between the City of London and the Crown was tested and ultimately strengthened by the reconstruction process. King Charles II had taken personal interest in the rebuilding and had issued early proclamations setting out principles for reconstruction. His government worked with city authorities to develop and implement reconstruction policies. While there were occasional tensions, particularly over questions of royal versus municipal authority, the overall relationship was cooperative. The successful rebuilding strengthened both the Crown's authority and the city's autonomy, as both could claim credit for the achievement. The impact of reconstruction on London's economy was generally positive once the initial disruption had passed. The building boom created enormous demand for labor and materials, stimulating economic activity. The improved buildings and infrastructure made the city more attractive for business and commerce. Property values generally rose as reconstruction progressed, enriching property owners and generating increased tax revenues. However, the benefits were not evenly distributed. Some individuals and groups suffered permanent losses, while others profited substantially from the disaster and reconstruction. The reconstruction period saw important developments in architectural education and the professionalization of architecture and building. The enormous building projects provided training opportunities for a generation of craftsmen and architects. Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, and others involved in major projects took on assistants and pupils who learned sophisticated design and construction techniques. This helped establish architecture as a recognized profession distinct from traditional building crafts. The reconstruction demonstrated the value of trained architects who could handle complex projects and solve difficult technical problems. The completion of reconstruction was gradual rather than abrupt. By the mid-1670s, most of the burned area had been rebuilt and the city was functioning normally again. However, some major projects, particularly St. Paul's Cathedral and some of the larger churches, would not be completed for decades. The coal tax continued to fund improvements and maintenance well into the 18th century. In a sense, London never stopped rebuilding, as the process that began after the Great Fire evolved into ongoing development and improvement of the urban fabric. The legacy of the Great Fire and reconstruction extended far beyond the immediate restoration of damaged areas. The fire had destroyed medieval London and created an opportunity to build a more modern city. While the rebuilt city retained the basic street pattern and much of the social and economic organization of its predecessor, it was transformed in important ways. The use of brick and stone construction made it much more fire-resistant. The improved infrastructure contributed to better public health. The new churches and public buildings gave the city an architectural character that was distinctly different from what had existed before. The experience of rebuilding influenced English approaches to urban development and planning for generations. The Rebuilding Acts established precedents for building regulation and urban planning that would be drawn upon in later urban reforms. The demonstration that comprehensive rebuilding was possible, even if comprehensive replanning proved too difficult, encouraged later efforts at urban improvement. The techniques and technologies developed during reconstruction were applied to other building projects throughout England and eventually in colonial settlements overseas. The social impact of reconstruction was complex and multifaceted. The rebuilding created opportunities for social advancement for some while displacing others. The rationalization of the urban fabric through building regulations and consolidation of properties contributed to a more organized and regulated society. The experience of working together to overcome disaster and rebuild the city created a sense of civic pride and identity. At the same time, the hardships of displacement and the uneven distribution of reconstruction costs and benefits created resentments and social tensions. The cultural significance of the reconstruction cannot be overstated. The rebuilt city became a symbol of English resilience and progress. The new St. Paul's Cathedral, with its great dome, became an icon of London and a symbol of English architectural achievement. The churches designed by Wren were admired throughout Europe and influenced church design far beyond London. The successful rebuilding demonstrated English organizational capability and technical sophistication, contributing to national confidence at a time when England was emerging as a major European power. The reconstruction also had intellectual and artistic implications. The enormous building projects attracted talented individuals from various fields and created opportunities for innovation and experimentation. The cross-fertilization between scientific inquiry and practical building contributed to advances in both areas. The artistic expression visible in the rebuilt churches and public buildings reflected contemporary aesthetic values and religious sensibilities. The Reconstruction period was thus not just a practical exercise in rebuilding destroyed structures, but also a creative period that produced works of lasting cultural value. The financial mechanisms developed to fund reconstruction, particularly the coal tax, demonstrated new approaches to public finance. The ability to raise substantial sums over extended periods through dedicated taxation was an important innovation. This approach would be used again in later infrastructure projects and urban improvements. The development of fire insurance represented another financial innovation with lasting impact. These financial developments reflected and contributed to the growing sophistication of English economic institutions in the late 17th century. The international dimension of reconstruction should not be overlooked. London's recovery was watched with interest throughout Europe. Foreign observers were impressed by the speed and scale of the rebuilding and by the quality of many of the new buildings. The architectural innovations, particularly in church design, influenced European architecture. The successful reconstruction enhanced England's reputation and demonstrated the effectiveness of English institutions and the resilience of English society. This had diplomatic and political implications during a period when England was competing with France and the Netherlands for European influence. The process of reconstruction revealed and sometimes exacerbated social inequalities. Wealthy property owners who had access to capital could rebuild quickly and profit from rising property values. Poor tenants who had lost their homes struggled to find affordable housing in the rebuilt city. The standardization of building types through regulation created a more uniform city, but also made it difficult to provide the kind of cheap, informal housing that had accommodated the poorest residents before the fire. This contributed to a gradual process by which the City of London became less socially diverse, with poorer residents increasingly pushed to peripheral areas. The Reconstruction period saw important developments in construction technology and practice. The enormous scale of building activity created pressure to find more efficient methods. This led to innovations in materials handling, in the organization of work on building sites, and in construction techniques. While these innovations were incremental rather than revolutionary, they collectively represented a significant advance in construction capability. The experience gained during the reconstruction of London would be applied to later building projects throughout the English-speaking world. The religious dimension of reconstruction was significant. The rebuilding of churches was not just a practical necessity, but also a religious act. The new churches were conceived as houses of God that would glorify the divine and provide proper settings for worship. The effort and expense devoted to church reconstruction reflected the importance of religion in 17th century English society. At the same time, the Anglican character of the rebuilt churches reinforced the established church's dominant position at a time when religious dissent was a live issue in English politics. The role of individual personalities in shaping reconstruction should not be underestimated. Christopher Wren's architectural genius gave the rebuilt city much of its distinctive character. Robert Hooke's scientific approach to surveying and construction contributed to the technical success of reconstruction. The political leadership provided by the King, the Lord Mayor, and other civic leaders was essential to maintaining order and driving the rebuilding process forward. The thousands of craftsmen whose skills and labor physically rebuilt the city were equally important, even if their individual contributions are less well documented. The documentation of reconstruction through maps, surveys, building accounts, and other records created an invaluable archive of information about 17th century building practice and urban development. These records have allowed historians to understand the reconstruction process in considerable detail. They also established precedents for record-keeping that would influence later urban administration. The careful documentation reflected the increasing bureaucratization of urban governance and the growing importance of written records in managing complex undertakings. The environmental impact of reconstruction, though not understood in modern terms at the time, was nonetheless significant. The enormous demand for building materials meant intensive quarrying of stone, clay extraction for bricks, and timber cutting. The brick-making process required vast quantities of fuel, contributing to air pollution. The disposal of debris from destroyed buildings created waste management challenges. These impacts were accepted as necessary costs of reconstruction, but they represented a substantial transformation of the landscape in and around London. The reconstruction period tested and ultimately validated English institutions and social structures. The ability to manage such a massive undertaking without descending into chaos or requiring authoritarian control demonstrated the effectiveness of English governance. The cooperation between different levels of government, between public and private sectors, and among different social groups showed social cohesion and institutional flexibility. This success contributed to confidence in English exceptionalism and in the superiority of English institutions, attitudes that would influence English political culture for centuries. The speed of reconstruction was remarkable by the standards of the time. Within a decade of the fire, most of the burned area had been rebuilt, and the city was functioning effectively again. This rapid recovery contrasted sharply with the experiences of other cities that had suffered major disasters, where rebuilding often took many decades or where cities never fully recovered. The speed of London's reconstruction reflected several factors: the strength of the English economy, the effectiveness of the institutional response, the availability of capital and skilled labour, and the determination of Londoners to restore their city. The human stories behind reconstruction were often poignant. Families who had lost everything worked for years to rebuild their lives and properties. Merchants who had seen their stock and premises destroyed struggled to re-establish their businesses. Craftsmen who had lost their tools and workshops had to start over from nothing. Yet many of these individuals not only recovered, but prospered in the rebuilt city. Their resilience and determination were the foundation upon which London's recovery was built. While the great architects and civic leaders received the glory, it was the cumulative effort of thousands of ordinary Londoners that made reconstruction possible. The impact on neighbouring communities was substantial. The influx of refugees in the immediate aftermath of the fire had strained resources in surrounding parishes and towns. As reconstruction proceeded, these areas saw some refugees return to the city, while others remained permanently, having established new lives. The demand for building materials and labour drew resources from a wide area around London. Communities that could supply bricks, stone, timber or skilled workers benefited economically from the reconstruction boom. This helped spread the economic stimulus beyond London itself. The reconstruction period saw changes in residential patterns within the rebuilt city. Some areas that had been densely populated before the fire were rebuilt, with larger, more substantial buildings, housing fewer residents. Other areas saw intensification of use, with buildings constructed to the maximum permitted heights and densities. These changes reflected the economics of rebuilding, with property owners seeking to maximize returns on their investments. The result was a city that was somewhat less densely populated than before the fire. Though still extremely crowded by modern standards, the question of architectural style in reconstruction reflected broader cultural tensions. Some favored traditional English styles, others looked to continental models, particularly Italian and French classical architecture. Christopher Wren and other leading architects generally favored classical styles, which they saw as more sophisticated and appropriate for a modern city. This preference reflected the cultural orientation of the educated elite toward continental European culture. However, traditional English building practices remained influential, particularly in smaller-scale construction. The rebuilt city thus showed a mixture of styles. Though classical influences were more prominent than they had been before the fire, the reconstruction of livery company halls represented an important aspect of rebuilding. These halls were central to the social and economic life of the guilds that played such important roles in governing the city. Many halls had been destroyed by the fire, and their reconstruction was a priority for the guilds. The new halls were generally more substantial and architecturally sophisticated than their predecessors. They served not just as meeting places for guild members, but also as symbols of the guild's wealth, power, and continuity. The decoration and furnishing of these halls represented significant investments, and displayed the Guild's commitment to their rebuilt city. The role of women in reconstruction, though less documented than that of men, was nonetheless significant. Women property owners faced the same challenges of rebuilding as their male counterparts. Widows who had inherited property from husbands killed in the plague or in the wars had to manage reconstruction with whatever resources they could command. Women worked in various capacities in the building trades, though usually in supporting rather than leading roles. The displacement caused by the fire disrupted household economies that had often depended on women's domestic production and informal economic activities. The reconstruction of domestic spaces was thus entangled with the reconstruction of domestic economies. The impact on London's food supply system required careful management. The city's markets and food distribution infrastructure had been severely disrupted by the fire. Ensuring adequate food supplies for the large population, including workers engaged in reconstruction, was a constant concern. The reconstruction of market buildings and the restoration of supply chains from surrounding agricultural areas were essential to preventing food shortages that could have triggered social unrest. The Crown and City authorities monitored food supplies closely and intervened when necessary to prevent hoarding or excessive price increases. The reconstruction period saw developments in retail and commercial architecture. Shops in the rebuilt city were often more substantial and better designed than their predecessors. The combination of living quarters above shops with commercial space at street level became standardized through the building regulations. This created a consistent pattern of commercial streets that would characterize London for centuries. The improved shop fronts and the more regular appearance of commercial streets made shopping a more pleasant experience and contributed to the development of consumer culture. The public health implications of reconstruction were significant, though not fully understood at the time. The improved construction standards, with brick and stone replacing timber, created more sanitary living conditions. Better drainage and water supply systems reduced the prevalence of waterborne diseases, though the connection was not yet scientifically understood. The wider streets and more open building plans improved ventilation. These improvements contributed to better health outcomes in subsequent decades. Though London remained an unhealthy place by modern standards, with high mortality rates particularly among children, the reconstruction of educational institutions was important for maintaining London's intellectual life. Several schools and educational establishments had been destroyed or damaged by the fire. Their reconstruction ensured the continuity of educational provision, though in some cases, institutions relocated to areas outside the burned district. The reconstruction period coincided with broader developments in English education, including increased emphasis on practical and scientific subjects alongside traditional classical learning. The rebuilt educational institutions reflected these changing priorities. The artistic community faced particular challenges during reconstruction. Artists and craftsmen who produced decorative work for buildings lost both their workshops and their markets when the fire destroyed so many houses and churches. However, reconstruction created enormous opportunities for those who could adapt. The decoration of churches required painters, sculptors, woodcarvers, and metalworkers. The furnishing of new houses created demand for furniture makers and textile workers. The reconstruction thus stimulated artistic production, even as it disrupted established patterns of patronage and practice. The reconstruction of Thames bridges was essential to maintaining connections between the city and areas south of the river. London Bridge, the only bridge across the Thames at London in 1666, had survived the fire, though buildings on it had been damaged. The repair and maintenance of the bridge was a priority, as it was a crucial link for commerce and communication. The experience of reconstruction raised questions about whether additional bridges should be built to improve connections across the river, though no new bridges would actually be constructed for many decades. The riverfront rebuilding did improve landing places and ferry services, making river crossings easier. The role of the press in covering reconstruction was significant. Printed news sheets and pamphlets provided information about reconstruction progress, building regulations, and property disputes. This helped keep the public informed and contributed to transparency in the rebuilding process. The press also served as a forum for debate about reconstruction policies, with different viewpoints being expressed about how rebuilding should proceed. This public discourse was an important aspect of English political culture and helped ensure that reconstruction policies had broad acceptance. The international dimensions of material supply for reconstruction were important. While most building materials came from England, some specialized materials had to be imported. High-quality stone for important buildings sometimes came from abroad. Timber supplies were supplemented by imports from Northern Europe. These international connections reminded Londoners that their city was part of a broader European trading network. The ability to draw on international resources facilitated reconstruction, though it also made London dependent on maintaining stable trade relationships. The development of specialized trades during reconstruction reflected growing economic sophistication. While traditional building crafts remained important, new specializations emerged. Architects who could design complex buildings, surveyors who could measure and plan large projects, contractors who could manage multiple trades, and specialists in particular aspects of construction all found expanding opportunities. This specialization increased efficiency and allowed more ambitious projects to be undertaken. It also contributed to the professionalization of the building industry. The reconstruction of warehouses and commercial storage facilities was essential to London's role as a trading centre. The fire had destroyed enormous quantities of stored goods, along with the buildings that housed them. Merchants needed adequate storage for imported and exported goods, and the lack of such facilities disrupted trade. The rebuilt warehouses were generally more substantial and better organized than their predecessors. Improvements in fire safety were particularly important for warehouses storing valuable and flammable goods. The reconstruction of commercial infrastructure thus directly supported economic recovery. The impact on London's social life and culture was profound. The coffee houses that had become important centres of social and intellectual life in the years before the fire had to be rebuilt or relocated. These establishments, where men gathered to discuss business, politics and ideas, were central to London's emerging public sphere. Their reconstruction and proliferation in the rebuilt city contributed to the vitality of London's cultural and intellectual life. Similarly, taverns, theatres and other places of recreation had to be rebuilt, restoring opportunities for leisure and entertainment. The religious diversity of London, though officially suppressed under Anglican supremacy, found expression in reconstruction. While the official rebuilding program focused on Anglican churches, religious dissenters continued to worship in less formal settings. The disruption caused by the fire and reconstruction created opportunities for nonconformist congregations to establish themselves, though they faced legal restrictions and social pressures. The rebuilt city thus contained religious diversity beneath a surface of Anglican uniformity, reflecting broader tensions in English religious life. The role of technical innovation in reconstruction should not be exaggerated. As most building was done using traditional methods and materials, however, there were incremental improvements in construction techniques, in the organization of building sites and in the design of structural elements. The experience of building on such a large scale led to refinements in practice that collectively represented progress. The documentation of construction methods and the training of craftsmen during reconstruction helped spread best practices more widely. The psychological impact of living through disaster and reconstruction shaped a generation of Londoners. Those who experienced the fire and its aftermath carried memories of loss and displacement, but also of recovery and renewal. The success of reconstruction created confidence that challenges could be overcome through collective effort and practical action. This attitude would influence English responses to subsequent crises and contribute to national self-image. The rebuilt city stood as physical evidence of resilience and capability. The relationship between reconstruction and commemoration evolved over time. Immediate concerns focused on practical rebuilding rather than remembering the disaster. However, as reconstruction progressed, there was increasing interest in creating permanent memorials. The monument to the Great Fire of London, designed by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke, was erected in the early 1670s near where the fire had started. This tall column served both as a commemoration of the disaster and as a celebration of recovery. Its inscription attributed the fire to Catholic conspirators, reflecting the political tensions of the period. The question of how to remember the fire and what lessons to draw from it remained contested. Some saw it as divine judgment for sin, others as an unfortunate accident, still others as the work of England's enemies. These different interpretations carried different implications for understanding what Reconstruction meant. The official narrative emphasized English resilience and the wisdom of the authorities in managing recovery. Alternative narratives focused on the suffering of ordinary people or on the opportunities for profiteering that Reconstruction had created. These competing memories shaped how subsequent generations understood the fire and its aftermath. The completion of major reconstruction projects became occasions for celebration. The opening of new churches, the completion of important buildings, and eventually the completion of St. Paul's Cathedral were marked with ceremonies and festivities. These events provided opportunities for communal celebration and for affirming the success of Reconstruction. They also served to legitimate the authorities who had overseen rebuilding and to reinforce social hierarchies. The grandeur of the new buildings, particularly churches, expressed religious devotion but also demonstrated the wealth and power of those who had commissioned them. The influence of London's Reconstruction extended to other English cities and towns. When fires destroyed portions of other settlements, the London example provided a model for how to respond. Building regulations similar to those implemented in London were adopted elsewhere. The architectural styles popularized by the Reconstruction influenced building throughout England. The organizational approaches developed during London's recovery were adapted to other reconstruction efforts. In this way, the impact of the Great Fire and its aftermath extended far beyond London itself. The long-term economic effects of Reconstruction were generally positive for London. The improved infrastructure and buildings made the city more attractive for commerce and residents. The demonstration of resilience and organizational capability enhanced London's reputation as a place to do business. Property values in the rebuilt city eventually exceeded pre-fire levels. However, the distribution of these benefits was uneven, with property owners and those with capital gaining more than tenants and workers. The Reconstruction thus contributed to existing patterns of inequality, even as it generated overall prosperity. The environmental transformation of the urban landscape was striking. The medieval city of timber and thatch was replaced by a city of brick, stone, and tile. This change in materials altered the city's appearance, texture, and even its smell and sound. The new buildings were more regular and uniform, creating a more orderly visual environment. Streets that had been dark and enclosed were somewhat more open and light. The transformation was not total, as traditional building practices persisted in some areas, but the overall character of the city was fundamentally changed. The legacy of Christopher Wren's churches became one of the most enduring aspects of Reconstruction. These buildings, with their distinctive spires and elegant interiors, became defining features of the London skyline. They represented not just architectural achievement, but also the successful adaptation of classical design principles to English conditions and Protestant worship requirements. The churches served their religious purposes while also functioning as landmarks and symbols of civic pride. Their influence on church architecture extended throughout the English-speaking world. The Reconstruction period tested and ultimately strengthened London's identity as England's principal city. The successful recovery from disaster reinforced London's central role in English economic, political, and cultural life. The rebuilt city was more impressive and modern than its predecessor, better able to serve as a capital worthy of an emerging European power. This enhanced status had implications for London's relationships with other English cities and with the provinces generally. The concentration of resources and attention on London's reconstruction contributed to the city's growing dominance. The role of credit and debt in financing reconstruction created lasting financial relationships. Property owners who borrowed to rebuild became indebted to lenders, creating ongoing financial obligations. These debt relationships sometimes persisted for generations as loans were repaid or refinanced. The Reconstruction period thus contributed to the development of more sophisticated credit markets and financial institutions. The experience of managing large-scale borrowing and lending for reconstruction purposes helped prepare London's financial sector for its later role as an international financial centre. The impact on family life and household organisation was significant. Homes that had served multiple generations were destroyed, disrupting patterns of inheritance and residence. Families had to adapt to new living arrangements during and after reconstruction. The new houses, built to standardized plans, shaped domestic life in new ways. The separation of living quarters from commercial space became more formalized, affecting how families balanced domestic and economic activities. These changes in the physical structure of housing had subtle but important effects on family relationships and gender roles. The reconstruction of institutional buildings reflected changing ideas about governance and administration. New buildings for courts, guilds, and administrative offices were designed to project authority and facilitate efficient operation. The architecture of these buildings expressed contemporary ideas about order, hierarchy, and the proper conduct of public business. The improved facilities contributed to more effective governance and administration, helping London manage its complex affairs more successfully. The relationship between public and private in the rebuilt city evolved during reconstruction. The state's role in regulating construction and providing infrastructure expanded significantly. At the same time, private property rights and individual initiative remained fundamental to the rebuilding process. The balance struck between public regulation and private action became a model for urban development that would influence English approaches to these questions for centuries. The reconstruction demonstrated that effective urban development required both public oversight and private enterprise. The international reputation of London's recovery contributed to English prestige and influence. Foreign visitors and observers were impressed by the speed and quality of reconstruction. Diplomatic representatives reported back to their governments about London's recovery, and these reports influenced perceptions of English strength and capability. In an era of intense competition among European powers, London's successful reconstruction served national interests by demonstrating English resilience and effectiveness. The completion of reconstruction did not mean the end of change and development. The rebuilt city continued to evolve as property owners made improvements, buildings were modified, and new construction filled in gaps. The processes and precedents established during the post-fire reconstruction influenced this ongoing development. The regulatory framework, the architectural styles, and the organizational approaches that emerged from reconstruction continued to shape London's built environment long after the immediate work of rebuilding was complete. The educational legacy of reconstruction included the training of a generation of craftsmen and architects who would carry the skills and knowledge they acquired to other projects throughout England and beyond. Apprentices who learned their trades during the reconstruction boom became masters who trained the next generation. The standards of construction established during reconstruction influenced building practice for decades. The architectural innovations pioneered by Wren and others became part of the standard repertoire of English architecture. The reconstruction of London after the Great Fire of 1666 stands as one of the remarkable achievements of 17th century England. In less than a decade, a city that had been reduced to ruins was rebuilt into a modern metropolis. The rebuilt city was safer, more orderly, and more architecturally distinguished than its predecessor. The reconstruction demonstrated the effectiveness of English institutions, the resilience of London's population, and the skill of its builders and architects. While the process was far from perfect, and while many individuals suffered losses that were never fully compensated, the overall achievement was extraordinary. The rebuilt city would serve London well for centuries to come. The fire-resistant construction prevented any recurrence of catastrophic fire. The improved infrastructure supported London's continued growth and prosperity. The architectural heritage created during reconstruction, particularly Wren's churches and St. Paul's Cathedral, became treasured elements of London's identity. The organizational and regulatory innovations influenced urban development throughout the English-speaking world. The experience of reconstruction became part of London's collective memory, a story of disaster overcome through determination and cooperation that would inspire responses to later challenges.